Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Jocelyne, and I am from ISA's Virtual Programming Department. We're delighted to welcome you to our second book discussion for the Religion and International Relations section Book Talk series. The framework of the Book Talk series is to discuss scholarships at the intersection of religion and international politics. Each session will present a book or publication from the last 2 years that touches on the relationship between religion and politics from a comparative and international perspective. As I mentioned, this is our second session, so we have two additional sessions coming in January and February. If you missed the previous talk, it's available on ISA's YouTube channel, along with our other previous virtual events. I'll include the link in the chat, along with the link for ISA's virtual programming page for more information on virtual events. Today's book, Uncertainties and its Discontents, Worldviews and World Politics. So our panelists will discuss the relevance of religious worldviews and the shaping of international affairs. For our discussion today, we're excited to have the editor of the book, Peter Katzenstein, and as well as the co-author of the book, Tim Byrnes. Our chair for ISA's Religion and International Relations section, Jocelyne Cesari, will be moderating this event. And I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Jocelyne.
Thank you, Josephine. Hello, everybody. Welcome. This is indeed our second session on book talks, discussions on topics that are in the intersection of religion and international affairs, broadly speaking, with also an eye on what's going on domestically. So it's really a great pleasure to have here the editor and co-author of the new book, Uncertainties and its Discontent, in Worldviews in World Politics. And I am going to follow this order. Peter Katzenstein and then Tim Byrnes will provide a few remarks on the book. And then I will myself give some feedback from the perspective of religion and IR, and we will have a broader discussion, also including you in the audience, through different channels. You can either put your question in the Q&A on the bottom of your Zoom screen, or you can also raise your hand and I will take the questions as they come. So thank you, Peter, thank you, Tim, and now Dan is joining us. So Dan, since you are here, hello, you actually will be the one before me giving some remarks and comments on the book, but the timing is perfect. I was ready to give the floor to Peter Katzenstein for the presentation, overall presentation of the book, and then Tim. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Jocelyne. Hello to everybody. So this book is one of a trilogy. I'm currently writing volume 3. And the first volume was about power, called Protean Power, Exploring the Uncertain and Unexpected in World Politics. That book, when I took it on the road and gave talks, elicited a uniform reaction, which was, I've never had this, about 15 or 20 seminars or lectures. And there was an embarrassed silence after I talked. And then inevitably somebody would raise their hand and saying, well, this is all very interesting, which you have to translate and saying, are you really nuts? And but let me translate it into my own language. And that language was unfailingly Newtonian. So Protean power is the power of the unexpected. It's Machiavelli. It's not Hobbes. So in some ways, you'd say this is sort of old-fashioned, but it struck people as a very different kind of way of thinking about power and about the world. And the book has 12 case studies. And the book doesn't say that Hobbes and control power is wrong. It just says there is another kind of power. It isn't just a risk society, it's also an uncertain society. And if you want to argue that it is only risk, you assume the burden of proof. And of course, social scientists like nothing less than carrying the burden of proof. So far, nobody has challenged me, but I think it's largely neglected. So because of this uniform reaction, I decided I wanted to do a book on worldviews, in this case, scientific worldviews. The last book on worldviews was Max Weber. That's a long time ago. But Weber wrote and published that book just as the physicists got going on the quantum revolution. So he couldn't see what we now 100 years later know. And so I focus on scientific worldviews in this book and developed a typology and, Newtonianism and post-Newtonianism and humanism and hyperhumanism, or what people call post-humanism, which I don't like. And then had people write chapters. And because it was on worldviews, and science is an important worldview, but so is religion, I asked Tim to write the chapter on religion because I wanted to present the broadest possible way of thinking about worldviews. And we had a round table at the ISA before COVID, and it was very exciting. It was probably the most exciting discussion I've had in academia. And what was most striking is that Mirja Korki, who is a post-Newtonian, and Tim were seeing reality almost identically. They are deeply into relationalism. And that was pretty exciting. Henry Now, who came into this project a little later, but with 2 chapters in the book, is a convinced Weberian and is very skeptical about post-Newtonianism. So Dan was a silent follower. I thought about Dan as we did religion, and I'm glad that he's here to comment on it. So the worldviews, different kinds, 4 of them, in the domain of science, deal with uncertainty in different ways. So in the framing chapters, in the first chapter, I introduce the 4 worldviews briefly and talk about some other things. In the conclusion, I take the metaphor between the garden, the jungle, and the park in order to say that basically the world of risk and social science and Newtonianism is a world of gardens. It's very neat and ordered, and that we seem to require this order psychologically and politically in order to function. But that world normally is a jungle, and therefore these 2 things are in tension, and the problem is to bring them into relation to one another. And this I do in showing that the Newtonian, post-Newtonian workarounds build bridges of different kinds. So for example, in the Newtonian world, there is subjective probability theory, which is not frequentist. I mean, it's a minor strand in social science, but it's, in my view, probably the most defensible. And subjective probability theory is all about the confidence which you have in your judgment. It's not about objective reality, because objective reality doesn't really exist. Objective reality is a creation of a Newtonian world, and the post-Newtonian world says there is no objective reality. The reality comes into focus only through the measurement and the argumentative practices which we impose on it. In the post-Newtonianism, there is a discussion on quantum Bayesianism, which is a different version of subjective probability. It is more radically subjectivist. There's no intersubjectivity in that world. So the quantum Bayesians provide a bridge too towards the Newtonians. And it is on that bridge in which I think modern science lives. So the radical subjectivism, which by the way is anticipated by Dilthey and to some extent Weber in the 19th century, links of course to the topic of religion, because it is my relationship to my God, which really trumps everything else. And that basically provides the circle closing between religion and science. And that is basically the contours of the book. The 3rd volume, which I'm writing now, picks up on a footnote in this second volume about small and large worlds. Leonard Savage, one of the famous statisticians of the 20th century, said, I have created Bayesian updating for you in the social sciences. He writes this in 1954. And this is useful for the small world. But as for the big world, I have nothing to say, and you would be fools to think that Bayesian updating captures the big world, the large world. Make small and large world shorthands for Newtonianism and post-Newtonianism. I will then, in that book, apply this distinction and the working through of uncertainty and risk to topics of political economy and finance, national security, particularly the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Anthropocene and planetary politics. And I hope to finish that book next year in order to show to my skeptical audience that these things actually matter in world politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Tim, please.
Thank you so much for having me. I want to start my brief remarks with an anecdote about another project that Peter and I did some years ago on, it was called, the volume was called Religion in Expanding Europe. I don't know if Peter got this answer, but people used to say to me, well, it must be a very slim volume, Religion in Europe. We made all kinds of arguments about how religion remained a significant actor in European politics, particularly in the way one defines Europe. But that's another story. But it seemed to me that people would invite Peter to speak, and when he was too busy or declined, they would then say, well, we'll have that other guy come. And I was invited to, I don't know, it was European Studies Center or something at Stanford. And I gave a talk, which I defined as telling Europeans they are more religious than they think they are. And as you can imagine, the reception was hostile. I didn't mind it too much. I had grown kind of used to it. I'm sure Dan is familiar with this kind of reaction in certain academic circles. But afterwards, I went to the coffee bar to tend to my wounds. And 3 people came up and they said, wow, that was really terrific. And I said, well, I'm glad to hear that. Did you notice that everyone else hated it? And they said, no. And I said, you really, like every question was hostile and denunciatory. And I said, do you mind me asking who you are? I don't know if I ever told you the story, Peter. They said, oh, we're PhD students in the religion department. And I was like, oh, well, okay, well, you kind of don't count. And the reason they don't count is because political science and international relations in particular have found all kinds of reasons, some of them I think legitimate, others not, to marginalize the study of religion in our field. And I think for our purposes and the purposes of this current volume on uncertainty and discontent, is that religion is largely misunderstood in the terms of the book. In other words, that religion is often thought of as quite a mechanistic feature of human life, right? Where you have kind of God's eye view of human experience, and it's a sort of mechanistic authority structure of all kinds of ways, where in fact, as Peter mentioned in our discussion at that ISA meeting, I view religion as fundamentally relational. And I talk about that some in my chapter, and we can talk about that later if you like. And that religion is a sort of a co-creative process that the faithful believe they are participating in recognizing that which as anthropology and sociology call that which is really real, and the actual bringing into being through religious relations, both in the community of the believers and in the relationship with the divine. So it's quite relational, in my view, not mechanistic. And also that people often sort of pigeonhole religion as the sort of structure of certainty in world history and modernity, where in fact, as I argue in my chapter, that faith is often grounded quite in a sort of acceptance of uncertainty, or a sort of view towards of uncertainty that will bring out a construction of being and community. And again, we could talk about those things later. But the other thing that I found that I now, having gone through this project, I look back on so many things I've written and spoken, certainly that day at Stanford, is that I was sort of participating in this kind of misunderstanding of the relationship between religion and politics, is that I was buying into what I think is sort of a methodological mistake. And that was as viewing religion and politics as 2 variables in a causal relationship. I remember early in my career, it was so difficult. I would go to conferences and I would send in submissions to journals, et cetera. And there was always a question of, okay, how does religion as an independent variable play an independent agency role in some dependent variable of political behavior or belief? And it was so constraining in how people thought about religion's role in politics, either domestically or in any sort of polity context around the world or international relations. And then in time, I participated in a process of kind of turning that around a little bit and saying, well, it's not that kind of unidirectional relationship of religion as the cause and politics as the effect, but also that political processes have powerful effects on religion, religious institutions, religious way religion organizes and articulates itself. But what I've come to believe now, and it was really my contribution, I think, to this project and volume, is that religion and politics actually interact with each other as what I call mutually constitutive elements of coherent worldviews. So that it's not that religion is causing politics or politics is causing religion, but instead that religion and politics are, in some sense, this isn't quite the right word, but fused into what Peter has invited us to call worldviews as a kind of a foundational level, a foundational way of understanding how individuals, communities, states, however you want to define it, participate in world politics. And I mentioned a few of these in the book, and I'll just really just mention them here, where it's a challenge to sort of tease out where the religion ends and the politics starts in so many groups. Christian nationalism in the United States, right? We have this sort of media game that's played. Why do evangelicals support Donald Trump when he's clearly not a very Christian moral person? Well, it's because their politics and their religion has come together in this kind of Christian nationalist way that it's impossible for them to separate out, I think, the two. Certain forms of what's called Islamism, right? Great debates about the relationship between this type of Islam and this type of political behavior. But in many contexts, in many parts of the world, there isn't a way where you say, well, this is politics and this is religion. It's a coherent worldview about how people understand their place in the world and how they ought to participate in relations with others. I think I say in the chapter, you know, a lot of people like to think of Dalai Lama as this sort of grandfatherly figure calling for compassion, but he represents this kind of Tibetan Buddhist understanding of his place and his community's place in that geographic place called Tibet, that I would challenge anyone to sort of separate out where he as a religious leader and he as a kind of a political spokesman end. Indian nationalism as defined by Hindutva, I argue in the book, Hindutva is not a sort of political articulation of a religious viewpoint. Hindutva is a coherent way of understanding India as a place and how the community of the community of individuals who participate in that religious tradition in that place think about that place and their place in it. Forms of religious Zionism, right, which we see so clearly expressed in the construction of a new Israeli government today under Netanyahu. And there's a kind of an inability, I would say, methodologically or empirically, to separate out the two. So I think this project was a really terrific opportunity for me to make this point, right? That when Peter introduces the notion of worldviews, he kind of talks about religion as an example, going back to Weber and others. Well, when people talked about worldview in other places, they kind of had religion in mind in one way or another. We've moved away from that for some, I think, good reasons, some, I think, bad reasons. But religion and religion's, the religious element to these sort of cohesive, coherent worldviews that the book is asking us to consider, they're still deeply present, it seems to me, in world politics and very much worthy of our attention if we're going to construct and think about this sort of new level of analysis that Peter is asking us to think about. So related to this is this whole part of the chapter that I did where I really sort of delved into the way that sociology and anthropology and to some extent political science has viewed religion over its history as religion as a kind of a very deeply implicated element of how many people, many communities over a long period of time have identified what people like Geertz and Durkheim, etc., Weber, talked about what's really real, right? How do we bring into being that which is really real? And this is a way of constructing identity, of course. This is a way of constructing community. And it's also, very importantly, and it's a shame Michael Barnett is not here to talk about us, it's a way of constructing place, right? That these religious communities and these religious worldviews often have a very specific understanding of their place in the world, both in terms of political identity and political participation, but also actually in terms of geographic space, that this space has ours in some kind of fundamental way, which has grown out of our worldview. And that worldview, therefore, it seems to me, has deep implications in how international relations and world politics and conflict articulate themselves in the modern world. So there's a lot more that I could say about what I had to say in this project, but I'd rather leave it there and move over to Dan for his comments.
Thank you, Tim. Dan, the floor is yours.
This is a fascinating book, and Peter has long challenged the field and been bold in questioning our most foundational assumptions. I think it's a great virtue and great service. Worldviews, related concepts of uncertainty, science, relationality, all have potential to challenge the intellectual landscape. Peter is one who listens. He gives platforms for a wide range of voices, especially those outside of well-worn channels, and encourages people to express their intuitions and convictions. And I think that that's a great service to all of us. The role of religion in this book is not surprising, and both because it fits the topic so well, but also one of his great contributions is to help has been to help pioneer the study of religion. So I'd like to say a few things, mostly commenting on Tim's essay, but with Peter's introduction in mind as well. So I began as a scholar who looked at religion to explain important historical and empirical phenomena. My first book was one of historical sociology that saw religion as a causal historical influence, conducted in a broadly positivistic way, according to the canons of what is known as KKV, or Kohen, King, and Verba, something I think has great value. And I became part of a group, a coalition of scholars. Tim is one, who sought to bring religion in as an actor in world politics. We challenged secularization theory and arguing that religion still mattered in politics, was even resurgent in politics, and that it did, or at least could act intelligibly and not solely violently or irrationally. Tim writes persuasively of Westphalia, secularization, and its disconnect with the reality on the ground around the world, a world where 84% of people believe in God, as the Pew Forum showed not long ago. I agree with Tim that we should not be surprised that people on the ground root their political commitments and religious beliefs and worldviews, and to be surprised as something as telling about the academy as it does about social reality on the ground. Later in my career, I began to write more directly out of my own religious commitments, not just as a scholar who thinks that religion is important, but one who describes it in terms of commending or using religious worldviews as the kind of foundation for my own analysis, in this case, normative analysis. I still did this at somewhat of a distance. My book of 2012 on reconciliation looked at 3 religious traditions, looked at their interplay and partial overlap with secular commitments and so forth. But I noticed that in making that transition from being a describer of religion to being more of a wielder or purveyor or thinker out of religious commitments, that I found this a more difficult road to hoe, and encountered something more like Tim's experience at Stanford, and in a way that tells us, I think, much about, or helped me to learn much about what the kind of field of discourse is in the academy today. I think that there's still, if one kind of invokes religious reasons or religious logics, one finds, I think, two major obstacles. One is still a kind of latent reservoir of the view that these views are unknowable, that they tend to shut down conversation. Richard Rorty, a member, called religion a conversation stopper. We're in a realm where meaningful exchange can happen. We don't have the mutual intelligibility, the mutual platform of a common set of reasons, where we can reason together. And then secondly, I think religion, particularly Christianity, still has a kind of a veneer or reputation for being associated with a kind of a neo-colonialist perspective, or coming in line of a kind of neo-colonialist critique, where Christianity is seen as part of a past in which Christianity dominated and still is practiced by those who would dominate. And so there's a kind of a liberationist narrative that is brought in. It's funny that this reaction can come from religious people. I remember one talk I gave in the University of California, Riverside. A young lady, an undergraduate, spoke up, and she said her first comment was, "Well, my pastor told me X." And the comment immediately sort of shifted the terrain of the conversation to kind of a "we're at church" logic, as opposed to "we're no longer having a kind of academic discussion" logic. And I think her comment was well intentioned. I lamented that it sort of reinforced the idea that religion was not something that could be discussed commonly. Recently, I gave a talk at Louisiana State University. My talk was one where I used Christianity as an underpinning for an argument for racial reparations, and argued that this could contribute to justice and unity in America in a polarized time. But I still felt that I needed to, when I gave the talk, spend a lot of time at the beginning justifying the role of religion in the talk. I talked a lot about the public reason debate. And then at the end, still encountered questions that were essentially asking why that was being brought in. All of it just to say that I think we're at a time in which, class seminars, talk circuits, panels at conferences, one would still fairly rarely see somebody arguing out of a religious worldview, where I think it's much more common to be one who describes the role of religion. It's much more seen as accepted. And I just think that's where we are discursively. Normatively, I don't think this is as it should be. I think that a religious person speaking out of his or her religious commitments, but being open to the same norms of discussion and scrutiny as are all others at the table, should be at the table. People of religious traditions have answers to the questions that worldviews pose, as Tim argues so well, in a well-developed form. Commitments to views of the beginning of the world, the direction of history, the existence and identity of God, gods, or other supernatural powers, morality and its content and its knowability, human nature, the nature of science, relationality, certainty, uncertainty, indeed, ultimate things, and the relationship of all these things to political authority, territory, and other temporal pursuits. Foucauldians, Weberians, Marxists, Kantians, positivists, liberals have views of these matters just as much as religious people do, and their views are just as open or closed to discussion, usually dependent upon who is articulating them, as are religious views, I would argue. My contention is that religious views are as open to agreement, disagreement, questioning, finding common ground, identifying differences, as are these others. I don't see a good norm, a good epistemological norm, why religion ought to be a conversation stopper or have to earn its place at the table of discourse. Today, one can be a scholar of religious worldviews in the academy, but it's much harder to be a holder of religious worldviews who conducts his analysis out of them. And in this background, I thought I would comment on a few issues that are leitmotifs in the volume and that Tim engaged in his paper. The issue of certainty is important. An old and common critique of religion is that religious people are overly certain. And what this really means is that they are far more certain than is warranted by the evidence of what we can know. The view of what we can know that makes this critique, I believe, is positivism and what Peter describes as Newtonian science, and which is really another kind of platform or variety of commitment to certainty. Quintessentially, the object of this critique are those who wield, or the embodiers of this critique are those who wield the concept of fundamentalism. And these are the people who are seen most to be overly certain or overly rigid. And this, I think, goes with the view of the sources of fundamentalism, which is said to be a reaction against modernity, its technology, its rapid change, its atomization, its pluralism. Fundamentalists in the logic hunker down contra mundum, either peacefully as Amish or in a fortress as militants. I think one reads, strong strains of this in Appleby and Marty's view of fundamentalism, a classical modernist view. Now, while there may be people who fit the description of fundamentalism, I think it's a mistake to see religion or even mainstream traditional religion as itself overly certain. Most religions involve a combination of commitments to what is certain and what is beyond certain. And usually concepts of mystery or the awesomeness of God, as described by Eliade, quoted extensively by Tim. It would be a good example of one who stresses that. In the mainstream Catholic tradition, which is my own, reason is affirmed as being able to know the existence of God, physical laws of the universe, the moral law, and can also serve as a handmaid or a collaborator in making sense out of revealed knowledge. But there's also a great affirmation of mystery too, that this is a sliver of what can be known. There is something much greater beyond it. I also think there's a certain connection between relationality and knowledge. That in a life of faith and a religious knowledge, in the Catholic tradition, I think in many other religious traditions, certainty increases with the depth of faith in a way that is analogous to, say, getting to know a person. Your view of that person, your knowledge of that person grows as you grow in relationality to the person. It is personal knowledge, and yet it is never mastery. It is always always can it be increased, always can be deepened. So there is a strong affirmation of rationality and the expansion of knowledge, yet also humility before what is far beyond knowing, and a sense that knowledge can ever expand further. And in these ways, I think this religion can fit the volume stress on both knowing and uncertainty. There is a strong role for certainty and mystery, yet wrapped in a kind of commitments to knowing that make religion fit closely with the themes that run through. I also came away with a great appreciation of what Tim says about the character of religion and first-person knowledge. I've been working on a paper on religious freedom, and I'm arguing for the human right of religious freedom. But my argument is that what grounds it is the fact that there's something called religion. And I argue that there is, in fact, a universal human phenomenon called religion. And I think part of the reason religious freedom is coming under attack as a human right is for two sets of critics. One is liberalism, where many people in the liberal tradition are questioning whether religion has a basis for having a distinct status in the law, a distinct human right. And usually they end up framing religion as an idea, a belief, or a worldview, right? And then the argument is, well, there's no reason why this kind of worldview is distinct from other worldviews. But the other kind of critic is the postmodern critics who argue, who doubt the universality of religion and then suspect that power is behind it. So I argue that there's a basis for a universal human right on the basis that there's a universal good called religion. But I argue that the best way to understand and to know this religion is to understand it by, as an analyst, adopting the first person standpoint of the people who practice it, asking what ends are they pursuing? What are they doing? And here I think there's a great affinity with, you quote Ninian Smart on this. Wilfred Cantwell Smith made this argument. An Enlightenment understanding of religion saw it as a bundle of ideas, you know. And I think it is, religions do have beliefs, do have ideas, but I think more essentially they are practices, something that people do. And I argue that the quintessential practice is seeking right relationship with a superhuman power. I'll explain more why I use that term if you want to, but and seeking it as a good. Interestingly, I think this is compatible with classical understandings of religion from the classical West and through medieval thought, Thomas Aquinas and so forth, as well as I think with Eastern religions. I'm greatly inspired by what I think is an extraordinarily important work on religion by Martin Riesebrot, the late religion scholar at the University of Chicago. And then Christian Smith, whose work Tim cites, was inspired by Riesebrot and builds on Riesebrot and seeks to develop his idea further. But the argument is from a first-person standpoint, and I also think this reflects Weber's Verstehen, Collingwood's notion of enactment. By seeking to understand what people do, what they are seeking when they practice religion, I think something emerges that's much more distinctive, but it emerges as a form of practice. So worldview, I still think is very important. I'm not dismissing that. And I think religious people do have worldviews and views about ultimate things and so forth. But I think it's, I worry about religion though being kind of reduced or primarily centrally understood as a set of ideas, whereas I think it's more centrally a set of practices. And that actually can be successful in getting us to a common definition of religion and a definition of religion that can actually thread through, this is the El Dorado of religious studies scholars, thread through major religions and provide a common definition. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to take up too much time. I had a little bit of a thought of about religion and science. I think in some way religion can help to undergird both the kind of, I don't want to say Newtonian, but science as it emerged in early modern Europe, despite, myths of Galileo and so forth. I think there's a lot about a Christian worldview that was dominant in the Middle Ages that helps to undergird science, particularly in the Thomist tradition. So for one thing, that notion of God as being a primary cause, but also there being secondary causes. God not only created the world, but then left the world to kind of run by itself, so to speak, under laws that God created. So the fact that the universe has these secondary laws that then kind of propel the universe, I think is powerful in forming a basis for science. Science is something that could be understood through rational inquiry, not through mere fideism or the will of God, but also the fact that the universe contained rational laws was a perfect fodder for science. But also I think that there are things in religion which helps to get us beyond some of the limitations of a Newtonian view, and which may have to do with ways in which religion transcends some of the commitments of Newtonian science. You mentioned the Big Bang in your introduction. I often take kind of a vain pride in the fact that the inventor of the Big Bang was a Catholic priest, Demet, the Belgian Catholic priest. And in fact, so the Thomist view, interestingly, is that, Aristotle said that the universe was eternal. Thomas didn't think that reason could know whether the universe had a beginning or not. Demet shows, makes an argument that it had a beginning. And so Thomas thought that it was revealed knowledge, not natural knowledge, that showed that the universe had a beginning. And so in a way, the Big Bang is bearing out that religious worldview, I would argue. So anyway, lots more to be said, but this is a great volume, and I think religion really, enters into the conversation with it in a very interesting way.
Thank you, Dan. I will take a few minutes also to give some comments and remarks. So, Dan, you offered a more normative approach versus a descriptive approach. My position has always been to argue that there is still room for analysis. I mean, it's not only describing religion, and here I'm talking for what we are trying to do in this section on religion and IR. It's not describing, it's not taking a normative position. There is room for the analytical outlook on what religion and politics have to do together. And here I'm going to start with your introduction, Tim. I completely agree that we are still locked, not only in the fact that religion is or could be the independent variable. I think we have moved away from that in the field. If I look at the Huntington work, it was a typical approach on, you know, clashes of civilization influencing conflict. I think the discipline as a whole has moved away from that, but we are still in a pickle, so to speak, because we are now in the opposite, which means to look at religion as a proxy for multiple things like, you know, extremism, anything where religion is present is actually something else, like, oh, extremism is led by poverty. It's not really religion, or it's geopolitics, or it's some kind of material condition. So it goes back to what Peter was saying. We still need this kind of certainty that, you know, religion is just a subterfuge or instrumentalization of causes that I can decipher through my Newtonian world, so to speak. So we are still there. And that's where, in my own work, I've tried to move away from that. And my references are not, unfortunately for me, but I say, if it seems that it can help decipher what is the role of religion and politics and vice versa. My reference is Norbert Elias, and it's interesting because everybody tells me, oh, Norbert Elias never looked at religion. Yes, but I'm not interested in his vision of religion. I'm interested in his vision of what is sociological survey. And he had all this discussion with Talcott Parsons, telling him, you get it wrong. Society is more than the addition of individuals. And so you have to introduce here notions. I'm not going to spend time on that, but it's more about continuous fluctuation and rebalancing of what's configuration. And it includes not only the religion or the politics, but also the individual. And we are not here yet. We are not, because indeed we are still on the illusion that if we have a good sampling of individuals, we're going to get the trends of a society. And we know we don't. We know that it doesn't work, especially when religion is at stake. You mentioned the fact that why religious peoples vote for Trump. Actually, what we see is that the most religious one in any groups, from Islam to evangelical, do not identify to this political project. So you can sample the individual as much as you want. You're not going to get that. So this brings me to the fact that if we want really to look at religion and politics seriously, we have to be at least cognizant with a lot of work that is beyond our discipline and that touch in anthropology of humanity, that touches in theories of religion. I'm not talking about theology here. I'm talking about understanding of what religion is. And unlike, this is a discussion we have with Dan, we cannot define religion. There is no, but if you want to analyze religion, you don't need to define it. You need to take it from some historical crisis where you see emerging new discourse. What counts for me is what do people put into their competition, alliance, clashes when they say we are religious or we are political. And here, the foundational difference is indeed religion versus politics. In my work, I show it is foundational to modernity, including to Christianity. There is no religion versus politics until the breakdown of Latin Christendom. And this this is not, because we think Christianity as some kind of superiority in deciphering religion versus politics. It is not historically true. I always give to my students to read the thesis of Jean Tanquerel in La Sorbonne, 1571. The Pope is a lieutenant of Jesus on earth. That's exactly what the Islamists are saying today about, you know, Islam and the Quran. So what happened? It happened that religion as a foundational community, including politics, has been displaced by the political power that presented itself as the new leader. And that's why the question of security and uncertainty is interesting. Until the war of religion, the Catholic Church proposes every meaning, from economy to politics to psychology to arts to knowledge. The difference is sacred versus profane. It is not religion versus politics. The religion versus politics come when the king said to the Catholic Church, it's enough. You are not able to provide the security of people. You have raised the level of uncertainty of who we are. I am the king. I'm now providing the collective meaning for everybody, and you are subdued to it. It will take a long time to the Catholic Church to adjust to that. And actually, the Westphalian system comes out of this breakdown of Latin Christendom. I teach students of religion and students of politics on the Westphalian system. It's fascinating. The students of religion know this history, but they cannot relate it to the worldview of politics. Interestingly, my students in governments have no clue where the Westphalian system comes. If you talk to them, they think it's, you know, like Minerva coming all harnessed and equipped. No. And so they see it from a very secular point of view. So what I'm trying to say here is that there is something in theories of anthropology that are not theology. And that's why I go back to Norbert Elias. René Girard, if we look at violence, and that's the core of uncertainty for human beings, René Girard, that he proposed a theory of religion that is very interesting. He said that the religion is the first community, first and foremost, to try to regulate violence, to avoid the destruction of people. It's even before, you know, man is a wolf for man, on which the contract theory will be held. But the first group that provide this minimal certainty not to kill each other is religion. And it's not about belief and transcendence. It is about building a community. And our Western scholarship has completely forgotten that the religion is not for the individual first and foremost, it's for creating a collectivity. And here my master, because I come from the continental tradition, is Durkheim. Durkheim said, as founder of religion, the first institution, he doesn't talk about personal belief or transcendence, the first institution to give social cohesion is religion. Secular politics will come later. And then you can look at the continuous fight between the prerogative or claim of the people belonging to this religious community to take on some of these collective prerogatives that are not there anymore. So the fight between religion and politics is foundational to the modernity that had pushed away religion from its claim to provide collective meaning for everybody. And this is something that is at the core of uncertainty, but we are not in the Newtonian way. Because the book provides a discussion on scientific vision and political vision. What I'm saying here is that the worldview of religion today has to be looked into this history of displacement of religious community from their first prerogative to give collective meaning, and how you can decipher today the interaction or politicization of religion and vice versa by the tendency of some members of these religious communities to regain the collective meaning for everybody. You mentioned the Christian fundamentalist or evangelical, that's exactly what they do. That's what exactly the Hinduists are doing with the Hindutva movement. They're saying our understanding of what is religion as a prerogative for the leading of the secular political community. Same thing with some Islamists, others have accommodated to the difference. So what I'm trying to say here is that in order to understand religion, we have to dissent from the belief or the practice to look at the way that the notion of a collective that is meaningful for everybody independently of different sets of belief can be managed when you have competitive claim of this collective coming from religious communities. And it changed the dynamic. It means that if we don't do history, if we don't take into account the work done in religious studies, we're not going to move very far in understanding this role of religion in politics. And so this is beyond the worldviews of the book itself, but religious worldviews today cannot be apprehended anymore only by the belief or by the cognitive function that we think are making religion understandable. And that's why I prefer René Girard, because it's about emotion. And for 1 minute, do not think that politics is not emotion. I mean, it's also emotion. We can try to rationalize this as much as we can. That's why I like Elias, because he brings in this idea that man is open to environment. So we cannot treat society as, you know, understanding it on a collection of individuals from this society. So I don't know if I'm responding very much to or providing some alternative, but to say that the question is, and maybe I should finish on that, I regret very much the unhistorical turn of the discipline. And because I was educated in political science in an environment where history was more important than variables, that's why maybe you are saying, Tim, nobody understands, or they say, well, are you nuts, as Peter said. That's why everybody may think I'm nuts, but it's not doing history as an historian. And that's why I think Elias, for me, is relevant here. It's doing history in order to understand, to make a genealogy of the present. And it's a different option. But so it's not normative, it's not descriptive, with the hope that there is still a room to analyze religion and politics and taking religion more seriously than we have done so far. So I'm sure both of you have reaction to Dan's and myself comment, and then we can open the
If I might, I just want to say something briefly in reaction to what Dan said about practice and what you, Jocelyne, said about community. And it might be interesting to the audience. We, as Peter said, we had really interesting meetings and discussions during this project. And some of the discussion was based on the debate, really, as to whether social science is still committed to certain kinds of epistemological and methodological assumptions that physics has long ago jettisoned, right? And so this is kind of an odd thing in the academy, that we're still insisting on certain kinds of things based on our misunderstanding of modern physics. And Peter can talk about that in a more intelligent way than I. But there's a really great research agenda out there about the relationship between these new ways of thinking about science and reality, grounded in relationalism and uncertainty, and religion. I'm not sure I'm qualified to do much of it because it's so difficult. One needs to be really educated in the sciences so deeply, but just it's related to what both of you are saying. And I'll give a couple of examples and how deeply relational religion is and how people understand it and how oddly open to scientific uncertainty and new ways of thinking about reality are. So Dan, for example, St. John's Gospel doesn't say God loves. St. John's Gospel says God is love. They don't say Jesus speaks the word. Jesus is the word, right? The Spirit isn't like an agent who acts. The Spirit is that which binds the Trinity and constructs the community of the mystical body of Christ. And these are all ways of thinking that most political scientists and international relations scholars don't really bump into every day, but they're deeply relational. They're grounded in this kind of understanding of reality and in this way of is rather than does. Similarly, we talk about the construction of community, and Jocelyne, you referenced some of the, the founding fathers of sociology, and talking about ritual not as something that religious people do, but that which constructs the community itself, right? I mean, the chosen people of God is a relational concept that is understood not in some kind of mechanistic way, but in sort of long-term historical understanding of this community's place in the world, both religiously and politically. Are the 5 pillars something that Muslims do? Well, yes, but it's also those shared rituals are the very thing that construct the Ummah as a transnational body, which acts in certain sort of ways religiously and politically. So I think there's a really interesting way that this book introduces us to think about the relationship between Peter's flat-footed, if he doesn't mind me saying so, observation that this is really not how physics thinks about the world anymore, ladies and gentlemen, and my sort of flat-footed assertion that religion is really much more relational and grounded in uncertainty in ways that these kind of scientific revolutions invite us to think about the relationship between religion and politics in new ways. Over to you, Peter.
No, just to follow on that, you're absolutely right. There is a discussion nobody follows between scholars of religion and scientists, especially the one involved in physics and cosmophysics, that are exactly on this ground on how do we manage uncertainty. But we have to introduce this scholarship on religion. We cannot just take it as a bunch of people having irrational belief, somewhere there. There are deep discussion today in religion. And if we want, again, I'm not saying it works for everything, but if it's religious worldview and world politics, they have to be not in the debate, but at least we should be cognizant with that as well.
Well, I say in my chapter, just quickly, I'm not particularly interested in that debate. I take religious people at their word when they tell me what they believe, and I try to move forward to try to understand what they're saying. I'm not interested in saying, no, you don't really mean that, you mean something else. And that could be a weakness of my word, but it's a commitment I've had for a long time. When people tell me this is how they understand themselves in their relation to the world, I try to believe them.
No, in the empirical way, you're right. In the understanding and analytical way, it's not about what they say and take it at face value, far from it. But there are attempts, meta-narrative today, beyond what people are saying they do, what they do, that we should be a little more aware of. But
no, I don't accept their truth claims in an epistemological way. I don't mean to say that. I mean, as I analyze how they understand themselves and their place in the world in the ways that this volume is examining, I accept what they say.
Yeah, okay, so that's Peter, please. I don't know if I...
So this was extremely interesting. I can now add to my introduction for my next talk that I heard people talk about this book and saying, this is all very interesting, but let me translate it into my language, which is what Dan and Jocelyne did. And I'm confused whether that language is or is not similar to the language of the conclusion. This is an exercise in meta theory. And I think the conclusion says that it's a world of both and, not either or. So I think you were all arguing about this or that. That's not modern science, and that's not religion. So as far as I can see, you're fighting the old war. I'm not interested in the old war. But you're interested in the old war because you sit at the margin of the discipline and you need to convince people. You don't need to convince me. I'm convinced. So, I wasn't sure whether I was an atheist or an agnostic when I started the project. I think I come out being an agnostic because I think the similarity of thought is the same. And modern science is not about rationalism. Modern science is about emotion and experience. There's a lot of this built in the conclusion, and that all resonates with how people think about religion, including Dan and Jocelyne. So I am a little uncertain about the story you are telling. You're not telling the story in relationship to the book. You're telling a story in relationship to your understanding of how social science understands religion. But my understanding of the last chapter of the book is that that's not quite relevant, really, you know. And come to history, on which Jocelyne concluded on, Smollett says that all laws of nature are historical. Everything is historical, okay? So for some purposes, these laws have been tested billions of times and work extremely well. And therefore they become part of the hard reality which kicks back. But everything is historical. So social science, you know, makes an assumption saying, well, we cut up history in different ways, you know, and we generalize within a particular segment of history. That seems pretty plausible to me. But whether time is reversible or not, you know, for social science, time is reversible. For the physicist, it isn't. I don't think for studies of religion it is. Okay. But my question to the two of you is, are you arguing with me or arguing with somebody else?
As I said, I'm not arguing with you, with the book as worldviews. I'm arguing from a point of view of, again, it's about our capacity to analyze what's going on when we say today the role of religion and politics and vice versa. It's a much lower kind of scale here. And yes, every history.
Jocelyne, that's demonstrably wrong. So when Donald Trump gets 40,000 people at his rally and the Pope gets 4 million, that's just the empirical evidence. As Dan says, you know, 85% of the people in the world believe in God. So you have to convince me. I don't think you have to convince others.
No, but there are political consequences on the way we produce scholarship that is misleading. And that's what I am interested in the fact that today, even in our discipline, there is this tendency, and Dan touched on it, at looking at religion from a cognitive point of view. You are right, everything is emotion, but try to say this to students today who are taught exactly the opposite in all their class in social sciences. That's my problem right there. My problem is, how do we transmit this new understanding to generations who are still making this big misleading approaches to what is politics in general and the role of religion in it. So I'm not arguing with you. I am trying to find out how can we train new generation in a way that is not the Newtonian way. I'm not even sure that post-Newton exactly reflect what the book is about. We are still far behind, and that's what bothers me. Not only academy, because let's face it, it may not have, you know, after all, we are little corporation of different things, but because it does have consequences on the world in which we live. When I hear today, people talk about Trump followers as Christian nationalism, it is wrong, but it's accepted by everybody because you say everything is history. They don't know that even the history of the nation of America built as a Christian nation. That's what I am after. I agree with you, Peter. My problem is, how do we go from where you are here to train the new generation to say something different? That's my point here. You see, so I'm not sure if I respond to your question, but I think we are not talking about the same goal here. Yeah. Dan, you may have another problem than me, for sure you have another problem than I.
There we go. So I wonder whether religion may include both ands. I'm not sure that they're entirely the both ends that you have in mind, Peter, but I know my Catholic view under tradition the best, and so I don't want to just say religion, because others might not see it the same. But I mean, it includes antinomies such as claims about what can be known rationally through claims that are beyond rationality, or where there's much more, say, uncertainty, or I'd better say mystery involved. There's the time alongside of not time. You have historical development along with universality. You have I mean, I think a lot of these antinomies, I think the tradition itself enfolds. I'm not sure whether they're quite your antinomies, but when I see some of the commitments, I want to say, well, yes and no. Like your strong affirmation of uncertainty. Yes, there's a very place for that, but there's also claims about, things we can have epistemological confidence in. So I don't know. I think that there's that's a both and. Relational knowledge. Yeah, I think there's a very big place for that. But I also think there's an affirmation of knowledge that is maybe less relational in a thick sense, but still is solid knowledge.
What is solid knowledge, Dan?
Well, maybe solid knowledge was the wrong word, but I think of relational knowledge as knowledge that grows through interaction between two beings in a relationship. Like knowledge of a person, for instance. But I think there are other kinds of knowledge that are known. They're realities that are grasped.
Yeah. So let's go to KKV, which is where your first book was, right?
Yeah.
It's not that KKV is wrong.
Right.
Newton is practical, and it's a subclass of a larger universe.
Yeah, that's what I would say. So
yeah, and
so both.
That's what modern science says, and that's what modern neuroscience says, and all of that. That's why experiments and experimentation, experiments very well controlled, experimentation, let's muddle through and try things out.
Yeah,
it's valuable. So
yeah,
that's not. I don't think.
Yeah,
you were saying, well, it's this or that, but I think the modern science view is that this smaller world, the Newtonian world, is not wrong,
right,
but it isn't the world.
Yeah,
and that's what religion says.
Well, that's what I would say about both and.
Right.
I mean, I think in the Catholic tradition there are, physical laws that can be observed. And, one can know reality to an extent through a kind of experimental science view of investigation. Yeah, confirming hypotheses and so forth. Yes.
Well,
but
I think the philosophy of physics is not behind that statement. The philosophy of physics says we have a dappled world, we have local knowledge, and it doesn't add up. And therefore, the notion of generalizing from the local, and you have to define what's local. This is Nancy Cartwright, and this is Deaton, who is a Nobel Prize-winning economist, right? So the notion of experiments versus experimentation, they're complementary. I'm just reading this morning Donald T. Campbell, who is the great methodologist of experiments. In the experimenting society, he says, the experimenter is the slave, not the advisor of the king. A totally different view about how social science interacts with the uncertainty of the world, right? Yeah. So it's not that when you're saying, well, we have some knowledge, yes, we do, but the world itself, that world is part of a much larger world, and it is an exception. It's at the limit. That's what Wendt is writing about, right? And I think that links up pretty well to the religious scholars' interest in relation, all the things which Tim brilliantly writes in this chapter.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that, I tend to think that that's similar to, the religious tradition that I'm most familiar with. I mean, the Catholic tradition would also say you can know, you can know purposes, you can know arguments through inductive arguments. Like I think of, for instance, the Thomistic arguments for the 5 ways of knowing the existence of God. Well, the objection you get is, well, that's not science. Okay, it's not science in the style of experimentation or laboratory confirmation of hypotheses, but it's a different mode of reasoning. It's a mode of inductive reasoning. You begin by noticing certain things about the world and then inductively reasoning from it. For instance, the contingency, you begin by noticing contingency.
Right, but the notion, the causal identification move, very powerful in the last 50 years, and particularly right now, it's reductive, saying efficient cause is the only cause. Well, Aristotle had 3 other causes.
Yes, absolutely.
More.
Yes.
So I think, it just adds up to saying that you cannot use the science which you're saying exists by just looking at efficient cause.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely, that's mother's milk, a Thomistic worldview.
I think not only Thomistic, but also Buddhism. I mean, them,
Yeah, no, absolutely, sure.
Right?
Yeah.
So, so the book, I think, and while it's only 1 chapter on religion, I think it's a very important one because, as I said at the outset, it relates to a conception of science, which is how modern science works. That's the modern science, the relational view. It is not. The social science believes that the classical model is science. And it's a fundamental misunderstanding of how science works these days. And we're only 100 years out of date. I mean, it's not bad, we can go on for another 300 years and sort of try to jigger the system. But it's sort of a little weird, right? To say that this is science. Yeah, it's a particular kind of science. And we brainwash the next generation of scholars to say that that is modern science. It's 16th to 18th century science.
Yeah.
Which, if I could just say, Peter, which readily marginalizes religion in the kind of discourse we're having here, because it's barking up the wrong tree and is going to lose in that kind of type of thinking about causes and effects and relations in that classical world, where it opens up a whole new way of thinking about the relationship between science, uncertainty, and relationalism when you think about more modern ways of understanding reality in the new terms of doing so. And like I said before, I'm not sure yeah, I'll just leave it at that. That just opens up a whole new way of thinking about the relationship between religion and science, which one would think scholars and practitioners of religion would rush to welcome and celebrate.
Yeah.
One more reading example, Emmanuel Wallerstein spent the last 20 years, it's a very substantial part of his life, writing about knowledge. Okay, together with Lee, who is at Binghamton, right? And the Gulbenkian report from '96 is sort of the articulation of this. Why is it that the humanities and the natural sciences have moved on? This was published in '96, they're in the end of the 20th century, and the social sciences are still stuck in 1880, including economics. So behavioral economics is beginning to make a shift, but it's not clear whether it's philosophically grounded, right? So Wallerstein ran as a historically oriented social scientist, ran into the same problem. And I think, most likely this book or this move intellectually will just put me very comfortably in the marginalized position of the religion and politics view. And I'm perfectly happy to be there. I mean, I'm old, so.
Welcome. But that's why I think that thinking of religion and politics and not of religion as a niche, because the moment you create this niche, you isolate it completely. And that's what's happening also in creating a religion and IR section, meaning you put together all the people who think about religion and they have no effect whatsoever on what's going on in the mainstream discussion, which is wrong because it's exactly based on this idea that religion is a specific niche that has nothing to do with the broader understanding of the world around and And we are here. We are still here.
So in the proselytization, I mean, I don't want to proselytize, but if you are in that business, I'm saying use this book in order to say,
yeah, exactly.
Science is not what you guys think it is. And
But
therefore,
I agree. But if you want to know to the people in the religion, and I are maybe the most open to that, we need to have a broader discussion beyond the religion and IR. What you are trying to do, I know that. But I mean, the question is, if we are just in our little bubble, trying to do that with no impact on the broader patterns of the discussion, we are in the trouble we are now. And I know by looking at what is discussed in religious studies, not by religious actors, that this debate has been going on for a while already. So it can be also the other way around. If what is said in the book can also benefit from a broader set of voices, not only in social sciences, but in hard science, quote unquote, or in other humanities, this is also a good way to go. For example, I mean, I just want to say something about one point in the chapter of Team. You present the profane and the sacred as a dichotomy that is religious, right? I mean, while it is not religious only, the nation is sacred. Again, if I go back, today the politics is sacred. If it's about the symbols, the institutions, the rituals that make us us, there is no more sacred than politics. And that this kind of continuous vocabulary slippery slope that that is important to keep in mind. Sacred and profane is not religious anymore. That's the whole reason why we have religion and politics, because the politics has a claim on the sacred. Look at the Temple Mount. It's not only religious, it is also who was the nation behind it, the Ayodhya conflict. It's a sacred at the national level. What we are witnessing today is people who are saying the sacred of the nation and the sacred of my religious community are the same.
Our project, we talked a lot about what is religion, and I tried to hew to two things. One, as Dan said before, I didn't want to define religion per se. It's such a diverse and enormously complicated thing. I tried to talk about specific religious traditions. And I also tried to shy away from the idea that everything is religious, so I sort of struggled with that. I'm not sure everyone on this Zoom will understand, but I was saying to students before, I had the opportunity once to go to a home football game at Ohio State. And, that was, it was a little scary as an outsider, but it also had every earmark and hallmark of the construction of a community through sacred rites and rituals. So I'm open to the argument in this context that religion, the secular and the profane, are not as divided as I might have indicated. But I tried not to just throw it all up in the air and say it's all religion, or I'm going to define religion. I tried to narrow it a little bit, but I'm perfectly open to criticism that I didn't do that appropriately.
So we have a long question, actually. It may help us wrap up things because it's for all of you. So Gregorio Betizza has a question. So for Peter, two questions. Is the Worldview book an attempt to ground interpretivism in science? First question. Second question, what is the connection between protean power, uncertainty, agency, and micro and worldviews? Okay, I'm not sure if I'm reading the question right. For Tim and me, but Tim, should we maintain the modern politics versus religious distinction intellectually and empirically, or is it a false dichotomy? And for Dan, I found it interesting, the evolution from belief / political theology in your previous work toward practices in your more recent thinking. what is going on there. Okay, now you have all your questions. Please proceed accordingly. Please, Peter.
So interpretivism in science, it's not an either or dichotomy. There's a lot of interpretivism in science, and there's quite a lot of science in interpretivism. So I don't think that that distinction, which has been made a lot of, holds very well, particularly because the interpretive part of it, going back to Dilthey, has been trapped in the thinking that Newtonianism is science. Newtonianism is a whole lot more than science. Now, Dilthey could be excused. I mean, he wrote in the 19th century, middle of the 19th century. But now, I think the interpretivists simply have been taken for a ride. They haven't read modern science. And if they had, they would say, we are doing what modern science does in a discursive community which accepts certain things as facts and evidence and others not. And those communities differ in the natural sciences, let's say, and in the interpretive community. What's the relationship between protean power and worldviews? It deals with, protean power identifies moments of unpredictability which create power potentialities. It basically says that the world we live in, one of constraints, incentives, and choice, as we understand it in contemporary social science, is part of a larger set of unfolding and reconfiguring potentialities. And at particular moments, which we cannot predict, those potentialities suddenly became actual and create power potentialities for choices. And that's an uncomfortable argument for people who think they are after regularities. And that social science is all about regularities. But I think it's clearly there. The book starts off with all the recent unpredictabilities in world politics. And this relates to worldviews, saying that the answer to seeing that world of potentiality lies in adopting a particular worldview. And that worldview cannot be the Newtonian one because it blocks it out. And once you open it up, you bring not only modern natural science, 20th and 21st natural science into the view, but also religion. So those would be my answers.
Thank you. Tim, you are muted, I think.
I said first, I want to say hi to Gregorio. I'm happy to see that he's here with us. I mean, obviously, a central argument that I've made today and I made in the chapter is that I do believe that religion and politics and the distinction between them can often be collapsed into what I'm calling this mutually constitutive elements of a coherent worldview. I don't think I want to say, though, that that means that there's no such thing as religion and there's no thing as politics that can be distinct from each other. But when we're talking about worldviews, and many of the examples that I use both today and in the chapter, there are, many communities around the world that define themselves in such a way that I would want to collapse the distinction. I wouldn't want to try to make a methodological or empirical distinction between them. But whether I would say, therefore, they don't exist as separate aspects in human life and human community, I wouldn't go that far.
Yeah, if I may just add one thing, actually, what I showed in my work is that it exists and it has reorganized and realigned everywhere what religious communities think they can do or cannot do vis-a-vis the collective. So because it was exported with the Westphalian system, the whole Westphalian system is ordered on this difference between what is religion and politics, and religion should not be part of it. So it did have influence everywhere. Even people today who say that they are challenging it, they are operating from this mindset, from this habitus that it is there, and that's why they challenge it. Otherwise, they would. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. I mean, as Dan knows well, that's just, that understanding of the Westphalian system is bad history, and it doesn't describe the circumstances in the 17th century or the years since. It doesn't take seriously the degree to which the Westphalian system constructed a state system which was imposed on other colonial peoples and religious traditions. I mean, it's just religion all the way through. I don't know if Dan wants to say that, but I certainly would. But this is from what I have seen is the way that it has been imposed indeed in different contexts and how people have endorse it, regurgitate it in a special way. So yes, it's a myth in the anthropological sense of the term, but it did have consequences. What interests me is not that ideas are wrong or false, it's what is the power of these visions and how does it change the balance of and the dynamic of power, also and power sharing in different contexts. And it did completely change everywhere what is legitimate or not for religious communities to do or not to do, or to think even more than do. So we cannot just ignore it. It's there in all the way that it's at least when people say this is religion, this is politics, and fight about it, it's there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I tend to agree. I think in the Enlightenment era, what's important is we can debate ad infinitum whether the religious wars were really religious. There were many other causes and so forth. But the fact is that there was a mode of analysis in the 18th century where many very influential thinkers thought there were religious wars, thought that religion was irrational, thought that it should be sidelined from politics, and there were great consequences for politics based on this view, whether or not it was historically accurate and so forth. And so, Mark Lilla can then talk about the great separation. People thought that there ought to be a separation. That's what, and, they sought to reconstruct politics on that basis as a consequence. I thought on the question of whether religion and politics are, whether we should maintain that distinction. I do think they are different. I think that I think they can be defined in, well, I guess maybe I'm a dinosaur. I think there are definitions. There are essential definitions, if you will. We can argue whether they're right or not, but I think religion has to do with right relationships with a superhuman power and the beliefs and communities and so forth that revolve around that. Politics is about creating institutions for pursuit of temporal ends through common institutions based upon law. These don't have to be, these are separate. A lot of times people in each side treat the other as if it's the same. So people treat politics as religious. They treat nations as religious, but they're not essentially so. Politics doesn't have to be religious, and nations don't have to be religious. And so then the inquiry is, well, let's understand the different kind of relations between them. So that's a long debate, but I think that I do think they're analytically separable. And I think that, in terms of Gregorio, hello, by the way, and great to have you with us. It's surreal not being able to see you. And it's in the evolution of my own beliefs. Yeah, I did think I used to, I have evolved. I used to think of religion much more like a set of ideas. And in my book, Revolutions and Sovereignty, I treat it as a set of ideas. And I've come to evolve somewhat in my understanding of religion. I still think that in Revolution of Sovereignty, ideas and changes in ideas were exerting the causal influence. So I'm okay with having fashioned it as ideas. But in terms of my views of what religion is, I think I've been very influenced by Riesebracht and Smith in terms of wanting to place practices centrally. Not throwing out ideas, seeing ideas as part of it, but I seeing as ideas, beliefs as attendant upon practices. And I think that that's a powerful definition. I think that some of the problems with not being able to find a definition of religion, I think we're attendant upon some of the misconceptualizations of religion as primarily beliefs or functionalist understandings. If it's functionalist, well then, lots of other things can provide the same function as religion. What's distinctive about religion? That kind of grinds us to a halt in trying to find something distinctive about it. Durkheim couldn't give us any good answer why religion or the nation could serve as the totem equally as easily. What is there anything special about religion? So I think, yeah, I think I have evolved in my own views towards a more definition centered on practices. In terms of Assad, I agree with Assad's critique of belief-centered notions as coming out of a particular time and place in history. So I go with the postmodern critiques in that kind of critique. I think they go too far. I don't go with them though in kind of their what I see as a more radical assertion of contingency in the kind of Foucauldian view that power is behind the contingency. That's where I would depart from them. But I agree with much of their critique.
The panelists, I have to leave in a few minutes to teach a class, but I do just want to, in this context, want to reiterate that in the context of worldviews as an element of global politics, I do not believe that religion and politics can usefully be made distinct from each other.
Yeah,
that is something that that's what I'm here to say. So I don't want to be misunderstood on that point.
No, I think we're all in agreement in that. That's the parameters in which we are and that everybody has to deal with, including the religious one when they don't accept it. But that's what it is, yes. Thank you.
Yeah. I was going to say, by the way, one thing I've noticed over the years in studying many religions is that virtually every religion has some kind of distinction between two different classes of authorities. One class of authority is something like clerics, which helps people access the superhuman power, but also recognize that there's another set of authorities like a king or a government or whatever that does temporal ends. I think that the spiritual temporal distinction runs through. It's very rare to find absolutely fusionists. I think there are some there, but the overwhelming majority are not fusionists. They think that there are two distinct roles, two distinct authorities. They have very different understandings of the relationships between them and their boundaries and their authority. But the existence of the two different, I think, is extremely common.
I don't want to reopen the debate, but spiritual, temporal, and religion and politics are not the same. The religion and politics on which we operate is modern. It is not a pre-modern with a redistribution of function that is not the spiritual temporal. It's something else, but it may reopen the debate. And I have seen the consequences on this distinction on what you said, the spiritual temporal in all tradition, including the Christian one, by the way. That's okay. I think we have 2 new members in our section. I'm just joking, but it was a pleasure really to have this conversation with you. And I think it shows once more that the most interesting discussion happened at the border cross-pollination of things. Peter, you please, before we leave.
No, I just wanted to say thank you for giving Tim and me the opportunity to present our work here and to listen in to a very postmodern, modern discussion. You know, I mean, I worry about the temporality argument built into our natural language. So, but that will be time for another talk. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Tim, and thank you for this wonderful book. Indeed, we're going to use it in our classes on religion and politics. That's a given. Thank you very much, and
thank you, everyone. Yes.
Bye now.
Great.
Thank you very much.